Hello, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month, like every summer, we're exploring books. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas, so be sure to check out 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. First, I want to give a big thank you to our series sponsor, the series sponsor who right now chooses to remain anonymous, but sponsored really more than just the books series. I have a friend who I've known for a long time. I've known him since elementary school, but we then went to high school together. I don't want to say who he is. He did not yet give me permission. I asked him, who do you want to dedicate this to? He had a few. First, he said, you should dedicate it to your mother for helping you fall in love with books, and that's really not a crazy thought. She really does. I really do owe a great deal of my love to books for my mother. And then he said, you can dedicate it anonymously to the woman who took me to the Queen's Library every Friday and sparked a curiosity to read every non-self-help book in the world. I have a friend who reached out to me. Thank God, he has the means to dedicate something serious. And he reached out to me and said, I want to start a book club. I want to get more people reading. And he reached out because he knows so much of what we do on 1840, so much of the way I use my own personal social media is to promote book reading. A lot of you may know, if you follow me on Twitter, and we actually now have a separate Twitter account that is just dedicated to Shabbos Reads. You could find that on Twitter. The handle is Shabbos Reads, Shabbos, Shabbos Reads, plural. And every Motzi Shabbos, every Saturday night, people post, what did they read this past Shabbos? What book did they read? People always a little bit outraged. Does that mean you read the entire book? Are you bragging? Are you this? But really, what are we trying to do here? I think more than anything else, we're trying to encourage reading. Read whatever you want. It could be lowbrow, it could be highbrow, it could be Jewish, it could be non-Jewish. And specifically reading on Shabbos. I think one of the real beauties of Shabbos is obviously this notion of like unplugging and having your own time in your own space, but very often people don't know. So what should I plug into? And of course, you want to plug into family, you want to plug into davening. But one thing that I think really goes across the board, and I love it because the barrier for entry is so low and really can connect, regardless of your Jewish background. It's something that everybody can participate in, is transforming Shabbos into a day of learning. And learning could mean Torah learning, obviously. You can read Daf Yomi over Shabbos. You can read, some more obscure halachic or a work of lumdus, of analysis of the Talmud, or you could read something more lowbrow. You could read Jewish history. You can read a biography. You can read, somebody just posted a comic book that they had read. And I think there's something very beautiful about using Shabbos as a way of people coming together and enhancing their own knowledge, enhancing their enjoyment through reading. Is something that I've always found to be honestly like pretty moving, a way that all different Jews can transform Shabbos into almost like a book club of sorts. But I'm always hesitant about book clubs. I think people don't like signing up for things that go on indefinitely. And I think secondly, book clubs are tricky because we have so many different forms of listeners from so many different kinds of communities. Different people like to read different things. They don't want to sign up for just like, oh, everybody's reading this X book. It's too academic. It's not academic enough. It's not Jewish enough. It's not this. So it's very hard to have like one track where everyone is participating. Instead, what we launched, and this is really with the help of this friend, it's a trial. We're going to hopefully roll out a lot more of these, is something called a book journey. I think the question that I get most frequently, I don't get that many halachic questions. I'm not a posek of any sort whatsoever, though I do get every once in a while somebody reaches out to me via like Twitter, like, hey, can you answer this halach? I'm like, nope. That is not my lane. But what is my lane that I do get a lot, especially going into the high holidays, you spend a lot of time in shul. People are always like, can you give me some book recommendations? I want to get ready for Rosh Hashanah. I want to get ready for Yom Kippur. I want to learn something. What's a good book of Jewish history that I should read? How do you know so much about this type of Hasidus or this part of Jewish philosophy? And I think more than just like reading haphazardly, there's a way to read to really build deep knowledge so that you really begin to understand Yiddishkeit, the Jewish people, Jewish ideas. And I read strategically. I've shared a lot of that. You can go on our YouTube page. I talk about some of the ways that I remember things, which we talk a little bit about on this episode. But one of the things that I wanted to do was to launch something called Book Journeys, which instead of a book club that goes on forever, a book journey, the first one that we're doing is 3 months long. It's one book a month. It's 3 different books. And then you'll get kind of like ancillary materials, discussion groups, etc., etc. And at the end of 3 months, it's like, oh, I now know something that I didn't know. A lot of times we read and it's like, it doesn't progress your understanding, even of the human condition, of anything. It doesn't progress your deep knowledge of something. It's just another way of almost wasting time, unfortunately. I think that's one of the issues that we grapple with in society nowadays, is to really build deep knowledge. If you heard Rabbi Weider speak in the Yeshiva University-based Medrash about some of the ills of social media, one of the ills that resonated most with me is what it's doing in warping our mind, our concentration of being able to build deep knowledge. Everything is just like, I don't know, you scroll through an article, you read whatever the latest tweet is today, and everything is like relevant, but for only 30 seconds. And instead, when you really learn a subject matter, and maybe, many of our listeners, I'm sure, in higher education in school or whatever, the things that really stick with you, there's no reason to not continue to do this throughout your life. And that's why we wanted to create these book journeys where you can sign up, and you can go now to our first book journey is available on 1840.org/book journey, 1840.org/book journey. Our first book journey is going to be, Can Jewish Law Govern the Jewish State? It is a follow-up from the incredible podcast episode that we had with Ellie Fisher. If you go back to our Zionism series, Ellie Fisher and I spoke about different models of how people have tried to incorporate the character of Jewish law into the emerging Jewish state of Israel. This is a idea that relates to Jewish history, to Jewish philosophy. It was an episode that sparked a lot of, not controversy, I think people really appreciated it, but sparked a lot of conversation, especially what's going on in Israel now, about how do we preserve the Jewish character of the state of Israel without it becoming, like an like a scary theocracy or whatever it is, which is something that Israel has been grappling with from its very beginning. And we're doing a book journey with Ellie Fisher. He picked 3 amazing books that can really guide you, and you can sign up now. I believe we want signups to be before July 1, so you still have a few days to do it. We're charging $18.40 a month, or you could pay it all for, I think $55 or something. It's not a lot of money. Helps us continue doing what we're doing. Feel free to pay a little bit more if you want to really help us. But more than anything else, what we're trying to do is build journeys where you're reading every single Shabbos. You finish a book a month. You have one book and you read a few pages one Shabbos, the next Shabbos, and you finish a book a month. And after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, it's like, wow, I really learned a new subject matter. That's part of what we're trying to do on 1840, building that deep knowledge within communities, within individuals. So please, if you are interested, sign up now at 1840.org/book journey for our first book journey with Ellie Fisher. All the information is there on the page. I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating. It's a really important topic for right now, and you are absolutely going to want to check that out. And really thank you to the sponsor who really gave us the kind of the seed to make this happen. There's always something special when friends support friends. There's something uncomfortable about friends supporting friends. I'm probably the most emotionally uncomfortable fundraiser who has ever lived. But this friend really reached out to me, and I have honestly no idea if he's even listening to this, but But really, thank you. It's something really special when somebody from your childhood sees what you're doing and says, I want to participate in this. I want to help build the next rung in this ladder in helping kind of transform for a more substantive, more educationally oriented Jewish community. It's everything that we try to do on 1840. And on a very personal level, to have a friend reach out and do that, even though, sometimes it's uncomfortable when you're involved in like fundraising conversations with friends. That's my number one fear, is fundraising, casting this transactional cloud over my relationships. And thank God that hasn't been the case. There's really been an outpouring of support from our listeners, from the 1840 community, and people do feel comfortable reaching out, whether or not you support us materially, financially, or just a listener. And that's really important to me. And it's even more special to me when it's a friend, when somebody who reaches out and says, I love what you're doing and let's build something together. So take a look at Book Journeys, 1840.com/book journeys. And that is the perfect introduction to what we are doing now and this month. And this month, as we do every summer month, it's a time for maybe something a little lighter. I don't know if it's less controversial. We're coming right out of the gate, really with something very important, which riled up the Jewish community. But before we get there, what we do during every summer is books. We talk to authors, we talk to publishers, we talk to speechwriters about the craft of writing and publishing, what they do, what they try to put out there and share with the world. Writing has always fascinated me from when I was a young child, because I grew up in a writing house. My mother is still a writer, always coming up with such creative thoughts. She writes on tefillah, on davening, on chumash, and has always inspired me and my own writing. And that's really what we're doing this month. And to begin, we are talking this month about the digital library Sefaria. Now, before we get into the controversy, Josh Foer is our conversation today. And I just want to publicly say I have been trying to have a conversation with Josh Foer for years. Josh Foer, aside from the fact that he is the visionary behind Sefaria, Josh Foer wrote a book that I want to recommend right out of the gate in the intro, because it has so much to do with things that we just spoke about in our series related to artificial intelligence, and so much of what we're about to do now as it relates to books. And that is his book, Moonwalking with Einstein, which talks about Josh Foer's journey to becoming a memory champion. He actually participated in like the memory Olympics, where you're memorizing decks of cards. In a minute, you are memorizing the positioning of some random sequence of numbers, random sequence of letters, and they train themselves to learn how to remember this very, very quickly. Now, this is my initial fascination with Josh Foer, about really learning to hone your memory. It's something that I have tried to do in my own life. I never like when learning goes in one ear and out the other. I learn with passion and with excitement, but I really like to remember things. I really like to have it at my fingertips. And so really a lot of his book helped me structure in broad ways how memory needs to work. I hope to do a separate video on how I organize my own content. I think a lot of people make some very basic mistakes. They're always forgetting. They're learning what they read, what they already know, so to speak, but they forget it. And for me, I really, really try to, I forget a ton, don't get me wrong, but I think I forget better than others because I have a structure for how I read, for how I learn, for how I develop more information. I could give it away right now. I'll do it really, really quickly. The number one way to remember things, and I think I say this in the video, is try to remember 3 numbers. We can do the experiment right now. Try to remember, I'll give you 3 random numbers, 54, 1,908, 1,412. So I just gave you 3 numbers. Try to hold them in your head. Try to really clarify them and have them just like, visualize them. And my guess is that you might remember the first number, maybe remember the second number by now. The third number, after a million, you already forgot it. There's no question after an hour, after a day, after a month, you're going to forget all three of those numbers. There's no sequence to them. There's no way to remember it. Now, if we were to play that experiment one more time and we were to play the game and remember three numbers. Ready, listeners? Here we go. I'm giving you three numbers: 94, 95, 96. Obviously, those three numbers in a sequence, you could remember them for the rest of your life, honestly. And that, to me, is the kind of secret to memory, is developing a sequence of being part of a story. And that's why I think reading effectively, assimilating knowledge effectively is so important. If you're just always reading random articles and random books and all the knowledge is kind of like swishing around in your head, you're never going to remember it. It's like the three random numbers, 54, 1,000, whatever, 1 million, whatever. You have all this information just kind of swishing back and forth in your mind. There's no sequence, there's no story to it. When you learn something from the beginning, from first principles, and then you build upon it, you learn about kind of the overall history of Israel, and then you dig into one aspect, and then you dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and you kind of go from general to more and more specific, but you have the overall sequence. That's like remembering 94, 95, 96. There is a sequence to what you learn, to what you know. It is part of a larger story, almost a larger narrative that you're already familiar with, and that way you're able to build deep information. And that's something that I learned from Josh Foer, and it's remarkable that what Josh Foer did for himself, becoming a memory champion, he allowed people to do in the broader world, which is have Torah knowledge at your fingertips, not because they are memory champions, not because they worked on structuring and organizing their information, their content, their Torah learning in specific ways, which is the way to do that if you're not going to rely on a computer. But he said, look, not everybody's going to become a memory champion. Let's figure out a way where the entire corpus of Torah can be at everyone's fingertips. And that is the vision behind Sefaria. Sefaria is an online library. It's available at sefaria.org. That's sefaria.org. And they have an incredible library of all Jewish texts. They have a translation of the entire Talmud, the Davidson Talmud. That's the translation from Adin Steinsaltz. They have the entire Chumash, Tanakh, and they have all these other texts. And whenever I write, I usually link to Sefaria so people can really look up these primary sources on their own. So why is this controversial? Why would something like this ever be controversial? But in fact, and I think it's a fascinating controversy and one that's important to talk about and think about, Sefaria, I guess, there was a controversy that broke out. It's not when it started, but Sefaria announced in the middle of May, I think it was like May 18th, they announced to the public a new translation. And they said, we're delighted to share that a new English translation of the prophets is now on Sefaria. This new translation was from JPS. And then in a follow-up tweet, they said, what is unique about this? And they said, they have a quote from Rabbi Shai Held, who is the president dean of Hadar. That's a non-Orthodox institution, Beit Midrash. And Rabbi Shai Held said that as we strive for the utmost fidelity in how we render the eternal words of Tanakh, greater gender inclusivity in how we talk about people, and greater gender sensitivity in how we speak about gods, JPS's new gender-sensitive translation offers us a momentous contribution to biblical study. They announced and this is really where the controversy began, I guess, or blew up. They announced a new translation that I believe was going to be the default for all users online of a gender-neutral Tanakh. Now, if I understand it correctly, what it means to be gender-neutral is, I believe, mostly about the name of God, and some translations, and you could look it up for yourself if you're comfortable, where they do that. I think they describe it more online. You can switch your default. It's not so easy to do. But people were really outraged by this. I think there was a real sense of betrayal that Sefaria, which was supposed to be for everyone, rolled out as its default something that was gender neutral, that at least at first glance, seems to be targeted much more to the non-Orthodox community who are users of Sefaria. Sefaria reaches hundreds of thousands every single month in Torah learning. And there are people within the Orthodox community who have been using Sefaria. Sefaria has never claimed, of course, that they are only for the Orthodox community. But there were people who said, we are not going to be using Sefaria anymore. We look at this translation as, let's call it a perversion of how Torah is meant to be presented. And that raises a good question about any translation, about what is the right way to translate something. I hope it's something that we're able to explore more in depth. I think a lot of translations, I don't know that I would use the word perversion, but it's certainly possible to have a really bad translation. There are ones in the past. This was a conversation that came earlier when Rabbi Soloveitchik was asked whether we should be participating in the J. By we, I'm sorry, I'm talking about the Orthodox community and Orthodox rabbis. When Rabbi Soloveitchik was asked whether or not we should be participating in the JPS translation, Rabbi Soloveitchik said, no, siree, we should not be participating because it's going to be contrary to Jewish tradition. You can look that up in the book, Community, Covenant, and Commitment, on pages 110 to 111. And that was noted by a friend of mine, somebody who I've been talking a lot of 1840 matters on, really from its inception. I have a great deal of gratitude to him, to Gil Student. And Gil Student wrote an article that is worth reading called Is Sefaria Kosher?, where he kind of outlines the controversy. Gil lays out a few different approaches for whether or not the Orthodox community should still feel comfortable using Sefaria, given the fact that there are non-Orthodox texts available on the website. Really lays out kind of with his very sober, classic way of writing. Gil is not prone to kind of like the emotional outbursts, at least not in his articles, maybe sometimes online, but not in his articles. And he wrote, I think, a very substantive article about how the Orthodox community should conceive of the fact that we have this online library that now includes books that are both from within our classical tradition and also has voices that are not within the classic Orthodox tradition. Should this be something that we should stop using, that we should boycott, that we should put pressure on? For me personally, I'm comfortable. Aside from the fact that my library is filled with both Orthodox and non-Orthodox books, it's not an equal ratio, but I definitely have both ever since I was a little kid, and I was able to read books that were kind of outside of my age-appropriate group. And my mother, the first time that I requested to read a book, she didn't realize at first I was reading like John Grisham's The Firm in 5th grade, and my mother didn't realize that there were inappropriate scenes in it. But I asked her to read The Godfather when I was in 8th grade, or maybe even 7th grade. And my mother said, I'll read ahead and I'll take out all of the inappropriate stuff. And she handed it back to me, and there were these black, I think I mentioned this once, there were these black lines on top of every, all the inappropriate words. It looked like it was like a redacted Mueller report, like the FBI handed it back to me. But I don't censor that deeply when it comes to books. I encourage really reading, and I think there are more effective ways to transmit, what are the boundaries of our tradition than boycotts and censorship. But I also appreciate the boundaries that many in the Orthodox community have erected in our tradition. It doesn't mean you should be, having your children read whatever they absolutely want. I think libraries are an act of self-disclosure and self-identity, and there are books that you want to have on your shelf. There are books that you want to have behind closed doors, and there are books that you don't want in your home at all. And Sefaria is this tricky thing, which is really a product of the larger question of the internet, where you have access to everything, and they are sitting side by side in the Sefaria library. So the first question is whether or not this is kosher, and Gil has that wonderful article. There's really a second question, which interests me more, which is how should those within the Orthodox community who aren't comfortable with this, and I think people are absolutely entitled to not be comfortable with something, but what's the right way to react? How should we present our discomfort? Should we scream at the top of our lungs online and say hashtag boycott Sefaria, which definitely people have done. I've done in my direction because I continued to quote from Sefaria even this happened, and people responded and said, "You're still quoting from them? Hashtag boycott Sefaria. You have to stop this." And I think the public question is actually a different question, even if you're uncomfortable. There are people who think it's a good idea, will put pressure on Sefaria to kind of listen to the needs of the Orthodox community, and that's what we talk about in our conversation. But I think we have to be very careful, and by we, I mean those who are within the Orthodox community, and even those who are uncomfortable. I'm not fully comfortable. I wasn't one of the people, you know what we really need on Sefaria? A gender-neutral translation. I wasn't one of the people who requested this, and I wasn't excited. I wasn't like, oh, yay, finally. I don't know how I probably wasn't the most uncomfortable with it. But how do we project discomfort online, especially when it's something that is uplifting far beyond our own community? And this really gets into questions that relate so much to what we do on 1840, which are questions of exclusivity and inclusivity. It is very hard in the modern world to be inclusive. It really, really is. If you include everybody, you're really doing something for nobody. At the same time, when it comes to Torah, a measure of exclusivity can very often lead to more inclusivity. This is something that I've heard and quoted before from my mentor, Rebbe and friend, Rabbi Moshe Benovitz, who one time told me, he said, exclusivity leads to inclusivity, and inclusivity leads to exclusivity. If you have something that's tailored for a very specific audience, it will lead to even more inclusivity. That's the exclusivity that leads to inclusivity. People will really feel like they belong. And sometimes inclusivity could lead to exclusivity. We want this to be for everyone, and then you have a product that ultimately is for nobody. But I think that what really fascinated me the most was like the betrayal that people felt from Sefaria. And I actually had like a little bit of a positive outlook on that sense of betrayal, because people have felt a sense of betrayal with things that I've done on 1840. And I don't know if I say this way overtly every time that somebody does something and says they feel betrayed, but I do have a little bit of a positive spin when people feel betrayed. I think that betrayal and feeling a sense of betrayal, which absolutely people have used that word to me as it relates to 1840. We've made mistakes in the past. We don't have to go through every single one. And there are people who reach out to me, friends who have reached out to me and said, I feel betrayed by what you did. And that sense of betrayal means that there was a real connection. You can't have a sense of betrayal unless there was a real buy-in, there was a real use. And I think that it is sometimes a privilege to even evoke a sense of betrayal. And it's something that I realized when it came to Sefaria, that people feel betrayed in the way they negotiated the boundaries of exclusivity and inclusivity, something that we try to do constantly on 1840, and we don't always do it well. And I think Sefaria, on a much larger scale, is also trying to navigate the bounds of inclusivity and exclusivity. And that sense of betrayal, I know, can hurt and can be painful. But when you listen to it thoughtfully, and I think they very much did and continue to do, that sense of betrayal is really saying, I felt this was for me, you had my voice, I felt connected, and now it's no longer representing me. And that sense of betrayal underneath it, though maybe it's not always articulated this way, is a real sense of connection. And so long as it's articulated in a way that is thoughtful, and I've been the recipient of this, and I'm sure, and I know, and I've seen Sefaria has been the recipient of this. Some of it has been, I think, over the top and outrageous, but some of it has been extraordinarily thoughtful. And those who articulate it thoughtfully, what they're really articulating is this was a part of my Jewish life, Jewish library, and now I feel like I'm not able to see myself in it anymore. And that's a feeling that I think is healthy, is appropriate, is holy. And so long as that you voice it in a way that uplifts rather than makes everybody else who still feels comfortable with Sefaria feel like a piece of garbage or like they're heretics or whatever it is, I think there is a way that people who feel betrayed can voice their betrayal without undermining the inspiration, the education, and the substance that others still are able to feel in it. And that's what I was most sensitive to, that people who feel betrayed in this should not undermine other people's, let's say people outside the Orthodox community or people who don't have the same sensitivities as them, to destroy their connection to Torah learning through Sefaria with their, I think, imprecise or unstrategic outrage. And I think we need to be strategic even in our feelings of betrayal. And all of this is just a very long introduction, and I apologize to begin the summer and the series with this. But of course, you can always skip it. But all of this is a very long introduction for a very real conversation that I am so grateful that Josh Foer was willing to have with us at 1840. Really, I have so many friends who work with Sefaria. I feel very privileged that they felt comfortable having this conversation specifically with 1840. We do go through a lot of these issues. So without further ado, it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our conversation with Josh Foer, co-founder and visionary behind Sefaria. It's really a privilege. I mentioned to you before, you are somebody who I have known through your writings, through your kind of Jewish entrepreneurial initiatives for many, many years. It is such a pleasure to be able to speak with you today, Josh Foer.
It is a pleasure to be on your podcast. It is a mutual admiration, and we've never met in person or even virtually before, although I certainly have been following you from afar. So really happy to be here.
I really, really appreciate it. I want to begin not talking directly with Sefaria, but the book that kind of placed you on my radar. It is a fascinating book called Moonwalking with Einstein, where you enter into a memory championship of who can remember the best. And the reason why it fascinated me, because so much of Jewish learning until this point has been about like remembering what page number, certain verses are on, or pages of the Talmud. I'm curious, before we get into the parallels between Moonwalking with Einstein and Sefaria, which I think there's a lot of overlap, what really compelled you to enter a memory championship?
Yeah, it's a crazy story. My first line of work when I came out of college was as a science journalist, and I had been sent by Slate magazine to go cover this wacky sounding contest called the United States Memory Championship, where it turns out people are not human savants with photographic memory, but they've all trained themselves essentially to memorize lots and lots of information. My curiosity kind of got the better of me, and I wanted to know more about how this worked and find out how come nobody had ever explained this to me, and what would happen if I tried to train my memory. And I just got in kind of over my head, ended up spending a year learning about my memory, learning about the science of memory, the history of memory and memorization, and entered the contest and competed in it, and actually ended up winning it, which was a really unexpected outcome for the journey that I had set out on, and ended up being a kind of unexpected ending to the book.
It's such a remarkable story, and I don't have a great memory, but I probably have an above average memory, and I learned a lot from your book. It's called Moonwalking with Einstein, I believe. I read it many years ago, but I didn't forget all of it, thank God. I didn't do all the memory tricks on the book itself. But the reason why it's called Moonwalking with Einstein is because memory, what you talk about in the book, is very spatial. You need to basically sequence, like if you want to remember the order of a deck, you sequence it as part of a spatial story, like that you familiarize yourself with your house, and the walkway is the Jack of Hearts, and your staircase is the Queen of Spades.
Yeah, that's sort of how it works. Sort of.
Tell me a little better.
The main trick that is used in these contests goes back to antiquity. It was supposedly invented by the ancient Greeks, perfected by the Romans, and the idea was called the memory palace, that one would walk through an imagined or real architecture in your mind and deposit images of the things that you want to remember. So it's based on the idea that we're excellent at remembering visual and spatial information. And so if you can transform information to make it visual and arrange it spatially, it just becomes much more memorable.
I'm curious, since you read the book, do you still find yourself being able to remember with more clarity, or is it only in the heat of the training that you're able to remember? I remember you remembered a deck of cards in a matter of maybe minutes or even seconds.
Yeah.
You fan out the deck and you were able to construct these memory palaces. Do you still find yourself being able to call upon those skills like in your everyday life?
Sadly, I'm a bit out of shape since my, days as a mnemonic heavyweight. But I will say this. The reason that these techniques were originally invented was, as you can imagine, not to memorize the orders of shuffled packs of playing cards, but really for oratory and rhetoric, and as tools for public speaking, for remembering what you were going to say. And that is by far their most effective use, and the place where I find myself leaning on these techniques more today than any of the other sort of tricks for remembering long strings of numbers or things like that.
That's really, really fascinating. And I'm curious because there's so many parallels between the work that you've done in Sefaria, which is literally making information timeless and memorable, and the work you're doing now. But before we get to that, I want to talk more generally about your work in the Jewish entrepreneurial space. Tell me a little bit, meaning you came out and you've been involved in Sukkah City, I believe, which we could talk about.
Yeah.
You are the visionary and very involved in this new Lehrhaus, which is kind of a place of Jewish learning that also serves food and has like a bar and gets drinks and like really brings Jewish learning to the people. And you also have Sefaria. But before we get into the details of any of those, I'm curious, what's like motivating your religious, your Jewish identity that you kind of like reimagine things that we, a library, reimagine a Sefaria, a sukkah, reimagine as like artistic sukkah displays in Sukkah City, a base medrash that you reimagine as Lehrhaus with drinks and all that stuff. What do you find is like the guiding mission of your Jewish entrepreneurial work?
So I would say, like, I just want to be of service to the Jewish people. But I think you're asking, like, what drives that?
Yeah.
I got probably what you would describe as, like, the best of the kind of Jewish education that the majority of American Jews get. It's just to say, I didn't go to day school. I went to, like, a Hebrew school, a conservative Hebrew school in Washington, D.C., where I spent most of the time, like, throwing paper airplanes and, like, in the principal's office, and came out of college feeling a sense of like having gotten the very, very best secular education that this society can provide. Went to the best private school, best college. I just, I feel like
checked all the boxes.
And I considered myself an incredibly literate person. And yet I was like basically illiterate in my own tradition, and in like, here I am, can read Borges' Fullness and Memorias, which you mentioned last week's part. I could read that in translation, but I can't read Maimonides in Arabic, definitely not. But let's say in Hebrew. And
you also know how to pronounce Borges and Funes the Memorias, probably much more.
Well, who knows what was going on? Who knows? Right. But a feeling of like something like I was missing, like how is that possible? And I actually asked this question about American Jewry more broadly. American Jews are the most literate culture that has ever existed in the history of the world, right? In terms of education, I've heard a number that 40% of trade hardcover books are sold to Jews. I don't know if that's true, but like...
It bodes well for us Jewish authors. Right? Yeah, for sure.
And yet, American Jewry is so comparatively illiterate in the literature, in the textual tradition of our people. And there's just a gaping disconnect there.
I want to push back a little bit because I totally agree with your description. Most Jews, and I include family, friends within this, could be described that way, but they never feel that absence. They never feel that sense of being Jewishly illiterate. And I'm curious for you, was that a moment? Was there an experience that like awakened you or opened your eyes? Because most Jews who went to Hebrew school, maybe got a bar mitzvah, are probably engaged, show up to synagogue at the key points. They're not, you wouldn't call them assimilated. They're engaged American Jews. It's like the new normal.
Yeah.
But open your eyes to the fact that like there's more out there, and not just be dismissive, like, and being like, I don't know, being literate in Maimonides is for rabbis. That's probably what most American Jews rightfully think of, like, I'm supposed to be literate in Maimonides. Like, come on now. It's a strange thing, which if you haven't been raised with that ethic, why would that dawn upon you?
I would say it's not something that dawned on me like in some, conversion at the side of the road moment.
Yeah.
It's like a slow dawning awareness of that, like that there's like I was missing a piece of my education. I will say, I think it is interesting that there is a kind of cognitive dissonance that one has to confront if one considers oneself highly literate and one realizes that one is illiterate in one's own tradition. That like either I'm not as well educated as I thought I was or pretend to be, or like that stuff over there must not be valuable, right? And that explains why I don't pay any attention to it, was never really exposed to it, and wasn't. I think that distance has to be navigated, and that's like not a lot of people want to step into it or confront it or know how to. And so I would say part of what motivates me is just shining a light on Judaism and how wonderful it is, and like how for people who might not be like looking at it the right way or might not be giving it the consideration that they maybe should or like could, and just make it shine and be beautiful and accessible.
In your life story, did that awareness of your own Jewish literacy, was this pre-Moonwalking with Einstein? Is this after Moonwalk? I just want to understand, like, in the progression of what projects have occupied your life, was this before or after?
I will tell you this. The first Masechet of Gemara that I ever learned entirely is Tractate Sukkah.
Okay.
Which was in the process of, so I'm like 20-something years old, just out of college, got my first apartment as a grown-up with the first outdoor space, build my first sukkah as a grown-up. Like, growing up, I came from a family where like we had a sukkah, it was in the garage, it came out every third year, every other year, like when my father got up and to do it, but it wasn't, we'll put it this way, we weren't religious about it, okay?
Gotcha.
And I was building my own first sukkah and had this realization of like, oh, first of all, how interesting. Like, I'm really enjoying, didn't come from a kit. Like, I was designing it myself. I'm like, okay, so I'm going to design myself. I want to, let's get the rules right. And starting to learn the rules of the sukkah got me into like learning Mishnah and Gemara, got me into like reading about the history of the sukkah. Like, this is kind of what happens to me. I get interested in something and I get deeper, and you start pulling on the threads. And then that led me to like, wait a second, holy smokes, there is so much potential in this structure. This speaks to so many interesting ideas that are actually incredibly contemporary and like, what is the nature of ephemerality? What is the nature of like structure? How does space get enclosed? And this realization that within this framework, this halachic framework of what a sukkah could be, was an immense space. And that led directly to creating that Sukkah City competition way back in 2010, which invited architects from all over the world to reimagine what a sukkah could be inside of its halachic design constraints. So here was this thing that, like, everybody knows sukkahs, they're all kind of the same. They're all kind of schwach.
Yeah.
Like, what would happen if they said, like, let's elevate this and shine a light on it and make it as beautiful and interesting as it can possibly be without changing it, right? Without, like,
exactly.
So I think that process of launching that competition, which, by the way, it's something like 180,000 people come through Union Square in New York City.
Yes.
It was one of the biggest, like, gatherings of Jews for, like, of anything in New York City. I
found out about it, Josh, just to let you know. I did my PhD at the New School. So I was literally walking out of school, and I had, like, again, the New School is a very different place than the religious yeshivas that I had been studying in beforehand, the very different value system, type of people it services. And then I walk out, and there's, like, a sukkah exhibit, like, all over the place. And I'm like, I literally thought that I was like in a New School fever dream, because it literally was like the yeshiva world and the New School design ethic merged together throughout like the Union Square Park. And it was, for me, it was deeply satisfying, because every child grows up and has that poster that has all of the different types of sukkahs, the kosher ones, the not kosher ones. They imagine what it'd be like to build a sukkah in a tree and a sukkah on a camel,
the back
or
of a camel, right?
Everyone's seen that poster and is like, I wonder, and they scratch. And what you did is really brought that artistic accessibility. You translated, so to speak, an old idea, not translation in language, but almost translation of experience through an artistic lens, which was absolutely remarkable.
One of the things that I took away from that experience, which I think is relevant to Sefaria, it's relevant to Lehrhaus, is part of what was special about that was that we're not trying to like reinvent the sukkah as something that it's not, or like trying to do this as a like really explore what is possible inside of its halachic constraints, what is like was latent in the meaning of the sukkah, forever, bring it out, make it shine. And as a result of those 180,000 people who were wandering around Union Square, and by the way, I don't know if it was really 180,000, but like in the post-Trump age, like it was
why not?
180,000.
Why not?
And it was everybody. It was like the Haredim from deepest Brooklyn who were coming with their kids
and check it out. It was like an activity.
But it was also like hipsters and artists and people who were not Jewish who were like, that's interesting. And that is something that we need more of in the Jewish world, is like, where can everybody like meet and like share a vocabulary and be together? We can focus on the things that like make us different, or we can focus on the things that make us the same. And that to me was really beautiful and meaningful. It was like for everybody, and it felt like it was for everybody. Nobody who showed up there felt like they didn't belong.
Exactly.
And that is something that we've definitely tried in Lehrhaus, this bar and Beit Midrash that we opened in Somerville about 2 months ago, me and Rabbi Charlie Schwartz. We create a space where truly anybody who is Jewish, whether you are deeply learned and or like deeply unaffiliated, can walk in and say, yeah, I belong here. Really hard to create a space like that, or to create an experience like that. But it's something that I think we need a lot more of in Jewish life in this country.
It is almost the reinvention of the ultimate Talmudic ethic, which is like all of these voices debating, not necessarily agreeing, but they're uniting centuries and different geographies, different personalities and outlooks all on the same page, which is really, to me, the form and structure of the Talmud is really what makes it so distinct, which is why I'm so curious. I'm trying to remember the first time I saw Sefaria. It was in the very early stages, and I'll be honest, I think it's possible it was just Chumash, just the five, maybe Tanakh.
Possible it was just Bereshit Aleph, actually.
Yeah, I had a meeting with somebody from Sefaria, and to me, I'll be honest, I was not impressed. I was like, there are like 100 websites that do this. Like, Machon Mamre has a translation. And I'll Google it, and I'll find somebody else's translation. I didn't see the scope and the intertextuality of how it worked. Can you take me through, again, we've spoken about Moonwalking with Einstein. I'm curious, in the genesis of Sefaria, was the memory championship somewhere in your subconscious or even explicit consciousness where you were thinking, imagine a world where all Jewish texts can be at somebody's fingertips? What was the motivation? Were you looking at Wikipedia? Were you thinking about memory championships? What were you thinking about during the kind of the percolating stages of Sefaria?
Honestly, it started from a place of frustration. If it hasn't come across already, like I'm sort of a weird melding of different worlds and backgrounds, and to be perfectly honest, as somebody who hadn't looked at a page of Gemara before he was probably 17 and hadn't learned, a Masechet of Gemara before I was 20 something, like I was going online, like, how can I find the Talmud in English? Literally, that's what I typed into Google search.
Google Talmud in English.
Talmud. And in 2011, I think it was 2011, the top search results you got at that point were some pirated PDFs of the Sonsino translation, which were like basically hard to use because they were
like the Napster days where you get like a pirated Talmud. Okay, interesting.
You got Rodinger's, that's his name. No, I'm probably even got it wrong. 1917 English translate, like somebody like some free culture person like partially uploaded it in like text format, and then you got an anti-Semitic website. And by the way, the anti-Semitic website had the best user interface of all three. And
gotta give the anti-Semites credit for their user interface. People don't talk about that enough. Great user interface.
I was like, how is this possible? And like, how could this be? And I called up my friend Brett Loxbizer, who had recently left Google, where he had been. He ran the team that digitized all magazines and newspapers for Google. And we had been on a trip to Israel together when we were 17 on the Bronfman Youth Fellowship. And we hadn't talked in like 10 years. Somehow I just like thought he would be the right person to talk to about this. And lo and behold, he had been thinking about the very same thing. And the conversation went from like, man, somebody should do something about it. This is like an embarrassment. This is a shanda. Like, I cannot believe that it's 2011, 2012, and this is the state of Jewish text of Torah, this thing that we care about more than anything. This is what we've done to Torah online. It's like, if you'll find it on an anti-Semitic website, somebody should do something about this. And somehow that conversation went to like, maybe we should do something about this. To Brett being like, oh, let me just build a prototype. And that's probably what you saw, was that first prototype, which was incredibly limited and like didn't do very much and like was glitchy and buggy, but it contained in it the seeds of what Sefaria has grown into. So really, when you ask where did it began with like a curious American Jew feeling frustrated that the Jewish community wasn't serving me, or that, the powers that be hadn't thought to make our textual tradition accessible to me. That sort of spirit of accessibility, I think, has guided Sefaria from its earliest days. Like, let's open the doors and make Torah not just free in the sense of free speech, like, anybody can say it, anybody can find it. Not like you don't have to pay for it. No, I'm sorry, not free in the sense of free beer, as in anybody, we're giving it away, you don't have to pay for it, but rather free as in free speech, as in anybody can take it, do what you want with it, create another app. We've digitized now thousands of texts, added translations to many of them.
Could you just pause for a second? Your translation team, do you have in-house translation team on Sefaria?
So no, we actually, when we started, that's how we thought we might have to proceed.
I remember vaguely things that were like user-generated translations. Yeah. So was there a period where it was like user-generated?
There was a brief spell at the very beginning when we were two guys trying to start this thing. There was no English translation of the Mishnah online, right? It's possible to believe. This was not that long ago. There was you could not find the Mishnah in English online. It's not like the Mishnah is so long, So we were like, all right, what would happen if we crowdsourced a translation? And lo and behold, like within a month, a couple hundred Jews from all over the world had crowdsourced a translation of the Mishnah. And it was basically garbage. Because like translation is a real art form.
Yes.
And so we realized, that's not going to work. We're really going to have to make deals with publishers to acquire the rights to the best translations that exist that we can get. And we started, and first they were small deals, sometimes for lesser known works. But we started to show publishers that, there's an opportunity here to reach more people, to be a part of building something. And the real turning point for Sefaria was when we cracked what was the original frustration, which was an English translation of the Talmud, because there really have only been, 3 complete English translations of the Talmud. And we were incredibly lucky that we sat with Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, and he got it from the...
You sat with him in person?
Yes, and he got it. It was one of the most magical, amazing meetings of my life.
Could you tell me about that meeting? I did not know that you ever met with him in person. I figured it was brokered through, I don't know,
your guy talks to my guy. No. Yeah. It was amazing. All right. So first of all, the whole project lives or dies on basically on whether we're going to have an English Talmud as part of it, right? That was the original. And
because you can find other translations of the Bible, of Tanakh. It's good. It's value add.
That exists, right?
It's not the game changer.
If you're trying to interconnect everything and and really make it accessible, that's the gem. And Brett and I are sitting down with Rabbi Steinsaltz. He's an old man.
Who connected you to him?
Elon Koftal.
Okay.
And he really deserves to be celebrated for having made that connection.
And where did you meet with him? I'm sorry, I'm asking nitty.
In an office building in Midtown Manhattan. But here's the thing, right? Like, does he know what Twitter is? Like, where are we even starting this conversation? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know what he knows.
Yes.
And it was one of the few times in my life I felt like I was in the presence of a true genius, because he was 3 steps ahead of us the entire conversation. He was like, first of all, I had this idea back in 1974, and it's wonderful that somebody's finally doing it. And of course, we should make Torah free. Of course, you can, like, well, my guys will figure out the details. But he was on board from the first second. But then he was like already going a step ahead. He was like, now what you're really describing is a platform for interconnected texts, and while it's great, you should do it for Torah. What I really love is if you would also do it for philosophy, so that when I'm reading Kierkegaard and he references Plato, I can just click with one link. And
he said that.
Yes, and our minds were just exploding, right? And then he says, and by the way, once you do it for the Jewish texts, you know who could really use this? You should give it to the Muslims because they need it too. And by the way, I bet you can figure out a way to get the Christians to pay for it.
That is absolutely incredible.
It was amazing. And lo and behold, it took a little bit of time to work out the details. We had to raise some money. It was like, this is a big project.
Sure.
But within a few years, the William Davidson Talmud, which is the Steinsaltz translation of the Talmud, was available in both English and modern Hebrew on Sefaria. And that really set the ball rolling in terms of like being able to make deals with other publishers, being able to acquire multiple translations, because the goal was really not to have just one translation of any text, but in the same way that if you walked into any library, you'd be able to pull off different versions of text, be able to have really the best of what's out there.
I'm curious just in terms of numbers in user growth.
Yeah.
In those early years, like just big picture, what was the user growth like before and after, and where are you now in terms of daily or monthly? Do you have any idea of where you guys are?
We started at 0, but we started at 2, me and Brett. And these days we're up over 600,000 monthly users. I think we're now close to about 700,000.
Wow.
Growing very, very steadily, which is wonderful. The depth of engagement also continues to grow. It's like, you have people who are coming because they're finding stuff in Google and like clicking through a thing and, clicking out. But what's incredible is, I'll come back to this in a second, but the amount of time that people spend on Sefaria is like unparalleled on the internet, right? And this is really one of Brett and my concerns is like, once we make something digital, like, does it become part of the sort of commodified world of like
sure
digital text consumption, which
like the TikTok of Talmud? You're just like flipping
through.
Is there still capacity for deep learning?
Correct, because screens have a way of sapping our attention, and like they condition us to read in a different way, in a way that I think is impoverishing. And one of the things that I think is special about Sefaria and that I'm proud of, I mean, look, I'm not day-to-day involved in Sefaria anymore. It's like a whole team of people spread out from, San Francisco to Jerusalem working on it. It's a team of technologists who are like fundamentally anti-technologists. Like they're like it's a deeply humanist team that cares about using technology for as much as possible good, and like really thinking hard about how to shepherd these texts into a digital era without absorbing the worst of what the digital era has brought to our culture. I think that's like really the challenge for all of us.
On a personal level, and I was an early adopter of Sefaria, always linked to it in my articles whenever I publish on Tablet. I mentioned earlier about the Talmud. I really make an effort, not for myself. I own a lot of these works in the hard copy, but I really do make an effort so the Talmud and Torah ideas can remain accessible, to always link to Sefaria so people could look it up, know that it's out there. The only reason why I don't use Sefaria more is actually coming back to your memory championship. I find when I learn things for the first time on Sefaria, it does not make the same impression on my memory. Part of it is I need to go to my shelf, get the hard copy, look at what's known as the Tsuras Hadaf, like the layout of the classical Talmud, which obviously doesn't exist for a host of reasons on a digital site, And sometimes when I'm learning digitally, like all the different sources, because they all look more or less the same, like they blend together in my mind. So I like Sefaria personally. I use it much more for reference than for first time learning, really coming back to your Moonwalking with Einstein, because I'm such a spatial learner. Like, I'm curious for you, do you read ebooks or are you like a hard copy book?
Both, but I read different kinds of books on ebooks. I read I agree with you, and I am the same way about books, and a romantic of printed book. Look, the printed book represents one technological solution to presenting information. I'm talking about the codex, sound of the scroll is also a way of presenting information. By the way, we're like the last people on earth who still read from scrolls. Each mode of presenting information, presenting the text, changes how we relate to it. Yeah. And we have weathered as a people some pretty profound transformations in media, right? From being an oral tradition to a literate tradition, from being a tradition that writes on scrolls and maintains scrolls that are sacred books, to a tradition that was able to embrace the codex, was able to embrace punctuation, was able to embrace the index and Surah Sadaf, which is itself a kind of incredible technological innovation that's like the hypertextuality or hypertextuality. And here we are at another major transformative moment in how media works, how information is conveyed, and it's gonna change how we as Jews relate to our text. That's just inevitable. One of Sefaria's really key principles is a sense of humility about that. And part of the reason that we not only make all these texts free is in the sense that you don't have to pay for them, but make them free in the sense that anybody can download them, anybody can put them on their website. It's nothing better than when I log into Al HaTorah and I see that they've got texts that are there because Sefaria digitized them.
People don't always know that. I just want to highlight that, meaning we'll get into some people's objections and some of the controversies that you have to skirt when you're running a digital Torah library for everyone. But a lot of times people are like, let's escape Sefaria and we'll go to another digital, website. And the analogy I used is like in kashrus, when you're keeping kosher, there are some people who they don't trust the OU. They want an extra certification. They don't want to use OU certification. And what I always, remind people is essentially the OU is almost inescapable at this point, because the enzymes, the food coloring, those, food factory in China, ultimately is probably under OU supervision. So it's almost impossible to get an industrial manufactured food that doesn't trace back to OU. And a lot of the other digital websites that I love that you support them, you give them all of your, I'm going to mess up the word, API. What's it called?
They either can use our API, that's right. So they're actually making calls directly to our database.
What does that stand for, API? I always use
Application Program Interface.
Gotcha. But it lets you the back end of your storehouse of information, essentially. Right.
So they're either accessing it that way or downloading the text. We make them available for anybody. Again, this is not we're not in this business to make Sefaria equivalent to Torah. We're in the business of spreading Torah, and that has always been Sefaria's mission from the very beginning, is set this up so that if Sefaria were to cease to exist tomorrow, somebody else could pick up where we left off and use the work that we've done, because we don't know what the future is going to look like, and we don't know how people are going to want to access our texts in the future.
Exactly.
But we know, thanks to the work that Sefaria has been doing, that those texts will be there in digital form, structured in such a way that they can be used in any machine.
And that notion that you kind of made reference to, but to quote, Marshall McLuhan was the media psychologist who famously said, the medium is the message, where it's not just about what is being said, but how it is being transmitted affects the very fabric of the message. I've always thought there's no idea to me that resonates more Jewishly, even though it was said in a very non-Jewish context, in an extraordinarily non-Jewish medium, if you know where it was originally published. Not a Jewish website or magazine, but that notion of the medium affecting the message is something that, we talk about in the distinction between written law and oral law. I always like to say that in the introduction to Rev Akiva Eger's Responsa, he wrote to his children who published it. He said, I want you to make sure that when you publish it, pay attention to the quality of the ink, the font that you use, and the paper quality. Meaning, he wasn't just talking about the importance of his Torah and what he was saying, but how it was being transmitted. And I think there's something that you gain tremendously. It's revolutionary to be done with humility of what Sefaria has done. But you eventually hit a wall. And the wall to me is the wall that I've heard a lot of this when it comes to programming and accessibility in general, not just in Jewish spaces. But programs that are for everyone sometimes wind up being for no one. And a program that's for a specific demographic ends up being much more inclusive. The way I've heard of it, inclusivity breeds exclusivity, and exclusivity brings inclusivity. It was designed for you, so that it's exclusive. I feel included. And when it's designed for everyone, then no one feels totally at home. And this is something that I think was bound to happen, especially in the digital world. And before we get into the most contemporary controversy on this, I wanted to ask about the source sheets feature.
Yeah.
You allow people to generate their own source sheets, which are then tethered to the pages that quote it. Now, obviously, the people making the source sheets, they're user-generated. Anybody can make it. And there are obviously going to be ideas that someone's going to object to them, the ideas that they're saying. You don't even have to take that much imagination.
No.
I'm curious, when you rolled out that feature, that was a later feature, what did you think about, well, let's say, I don't know, an anti-Semite. We're going to turn back the clock to the original online Talmud. We'll just have anti-Semites making source sheets of objectionable passages in the Talmud. We'll just have people being cynical or undermining Jewish intellectual history. When you allowed the user-generated feature, which obviously from a distance is the ultimate vehicle for accessibility, did you already foresee and have stop measures that would kind of ensure that this inclusivity wouldn't lead to the ultimate exclusivity or undermining the very mission of Sefaria?
Great question. So first of all, interestingly, the source sheets were there almost from if not day zero, day one. And here's why.
Okay.
Because when we were setting out, and this is comes back to how did two guys who are not scholars, are not Jewish professionals, are not, how do you start the platform for the future of Torah? Well, we went out and we were listening to people, and educators had a real pain point. Source sheets in the days before Sefaria were really hard to make.
Yes.
You had to get your scissors, you had to get your photocopies.
I miss those days. I'll be honest with you. I love the scissor, and you saw the outline of the Scotch tape I miss those source sheets, even though
I've got one right next to me that I'm about to teach a class from tonight. So don't tell anybody. So we said, let's solve that problem. And in the process of solving that problem, educators got bought in to helping us grow Sefaria. A lot of those people who did that first misguided crowdsourced translation of the Talmud, a lot of those were educators who were using the source sheets. And that was a way of sort of bootstrapping this project into existence until we could get the publishers to play ball, until we could get really
sure
to embrace this. I think we didn't anticipate just how successful the source sheets would be, because they really solved a problem for people. I think it's now 600,000 source sheets have been created on Sefaria, something like that. I mean, that's an insane number of source sheets. That is a lot of Torah being remixed, taught, retaught, educators borrowing from other educators. There's a whole conversation and community that has grown up around them that's inspiring. What you point to, though, is especially when you've got people making their own source sheets, not everybody's going to agree with everything. And for sure, one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot is this question of inclusivity and what happens when you have the ability for anybody to make a source sheet. First of all, I think Sefaria does a pretty good job at keeping the anti-Semites out, keeping the
Do you have moderators on the source sheets? Have you ever had to take down a source sheet?
I think it happens with some regularity.
Okay, I would assume so.
Less than you would guess. If you're in good faith engaging with Torah, most people are there in good faith. So one of the things that we've been talking about, I think is going to happen in the next year or so, is we're going to separate Sefaria into effectively two sites, really reflecting the two different kinds of institutions that Sefaria is becoming. One is a library, and the other is a Beit Midrash. So if you think of the library as the place where the books are pristine, where the volume is quiet, where like one is engaging with the past, as opposed to the Beit Midrash, which is a very different kind of space, where the volume is loud, where the space is argumentative, where like the conversation is happening now. In doing so, I think we'll be able to make better experiences
for
in
both
cases.
Who are coming for two very different purposes.
Correct. I really do want Sefaria to be for everyone, and like inclusivity is like a two-way. Like it's not like it just goes one way or the other. Like you want some people to, if you want everybody to feel comfortable in a space, you got to listen to everybody. And if there are people who don't want to see source sheets next to their when they're learning Torah, like I don't want them to have to see anything they don't want to see, and I can't guarantee what they're going to see. Right. So I think that's the direction Sefaria is headed in, and it's really trying to
to lean more directly into each experience, and almost seeing that these are two very different experiences that people want to have on here, and almost separating them will make each one independently stronger. But I want to go into kind of the most contemporary controversy. I debated weighing in on it online, and I have some of my own thoughts, but I wanted to hear from you first, both on a very technical level and then some of the reactions in the process. Sefaria recently announced that they're going to include a new gender-neutral version of the JPS translation of Tanakh, taking out a lot of the pronouns that you would normally see and allow for a gender-neutral translation. And there were many who felt, and some who wrote quite publicly about this, people who I know, who felt that this was almost a perversion, not a translation, but the allowing kind of, maybe they would accuse you of having woke politics insert themselves into what was a historic Torah translation. I first want to begin, just so we have it clear, do you have a clear understanding of what exactly the gender-neutral translation means? Does that mean there are no gendered pronouns throughout the entire Torah, or that's only in relation to God?
No, actually, in my sense of it, having read both the introduction written by the scholars who put it together, but also, really done some comparing of bits of that translation to other translations, it's actually not gender neutral or even particularly woke, it seems to me. It's like more like sometimes avot means fathers, sometimes avot means ancestors. And like if you're doing a good translation, like you want to figure out which one is which. Sometimes
Banim is sons, and sometimes Banim is children.
Sometimes
I
man
know
means like humankind, mankind. Sometimes man means like men. My sense is that's really what the translation is trying to do, is like tease those things apart. Like there's some cases in that translation where there were things that like previous translations had rendered gender neutral that are then rendered actually as masculine in this, because that's actually if you're taking a scholarly approach to this, no, they're definitely talking about just the men here. So it was one of these things where I think the language around this translation, like when you say gender sensitive today, that is
that's a hot button issue right
there.
That
is so fraught in our culture right now that it's triggering for everybody.
Yes.
And I think it makes what is like actually just it's definitely a perspective, right? Like it's not like a crazy perspective. It's like a translation. A translation is an act of interpretation. All translation is kissing through a veil, as Amichai said, and like it may be one that you're interested in, it may not be, but it's a translation. It's one of, I think, more than a dozen that exist on Sefaria. And one of the core principles as far as like, you don't want to use something, if you don't want to see it, you don't have to see, like you don't have to pull it off the shelf. We're like, this is a book that exists in the YU library, right? Nobody's talking about like we got to cancel the YU library because it has this book on its shelf. No, it's a library. You can pull it off or not pull it off. It's not for you. It's not for you. Great.
Yeah.
But it's there because it's a serious work created by serious people. I mean, the Jewish Publication Society is like one of the oldest and most reputable Jewish publishing houses in America. Were we not to include, most contemporary translation of Tanakh I think we'd be doing something wrong.
I two things. Number one, I myself have been guilty, if you pay close attention, of gender neutral translations. I do it all the time because of words like when we're talking about, bunim, or even like the avos, the patriarchs. There are instances where it doesn't literally mean fathers, it just means ancestors. That's an excellent example. I very often, banim will translate as children rather than sons. Because
but sometimes it actually means sons, right?
Correct. And I do pay attention to those distinctions. But I want to come back to what I saw, and I actually think in a way it was a compliment, and it is a compliment that is given what the Ramban described the Ibn Ezra, which was a tochacha megula va'ahava mesuteris, an open rebuke and a hidden love. And I have been subject to this on 1840, and I think that in many ways, Sefaria has just been subject to it, and I want to hear your response. The way I understood it, and I saw people, and not everyone, there were people who, would say hashtag boycott Sefaria. It was so instinctive. It was so culture war, which I think is a type of discourse that is never befitting of the timelessness of Torah. We don't need to diminish Torah into the latest cultural war. But I think other people, and I've been subject to this myself, and I'm sensitive to this, there was a sense of betrayal because they had developed such an intimate connection with the product. I've been listening to you. I've been using this product. I've been listening to 1840, whatever it is. How could you? It took them out. It almost is like when you break the fourth wall, or when somebody opens up an exit door and sunlight comes in the movie theater, and you realize that this intimate experience was not just for me. And I saw well-minded, very reasonable people who were concerned that, like, look, we love Sefaria. Maybe it is not for us, because I think the main concern, a lot of it came from just, they didn't understand what gender neutral translation means, and maybe we could come up with a better title for that doesn't, play into contemporary culture wars, which are just like, I don't know, it's like a wasp's nest of discourse. But I think for other people, there was a concern that, like, why does this have to be my default? Why, like the announcement, like, you're taking away this experience that I was able to use and enhance my Torah so well. And again, I'm playing devil's advocate, not because I felt this way. I personally did not, and actually hurt me a great deal that Sefaria became this football in this war. I identify with it because people have approached me the same way. Well, they'll listen to something that I say, they'll react to a guest I had or something that they said, and there'll be a real sense of betrayal, which can only emerge from an intimacy. I don't care what's on my cereal box. I don't care what's on my sneakers. I care what's on Sefaria. I care what's on the people who I listen to and develop those relationships to. So I want to ask you, were you surprised by the back? Did it catch you off guard?
Honestly, it did. And I think a lot of the reaction was honestly around like some of how this was communicated, and like the way that we are sprung right now to these kind of culture war tropes. And like it sounded like Sefaria was wading into a culture war issue, and like therefore everybody knows that like we got to jump. And that certainly wasn't anybody's intention here. And I think if you look closely at this translation, by the way, like you realize it's like, whoa, that's actually not what's even going on here, despite the fact that it's, quote unquote gender, like that's just not.
It's not the gender sensitivity that you're hearing.
It's not what you're thinking of.
Talk radio or in the news. Correct.
And like, listen, everybody's got a different sense of what's like inside the box and what's outside the box. But this felt like a moment for people to spring into action when I'm not sure it was. I will say, like, it's not the I just opened up Sefaria this morning. I was like, oh, wait a minute, right? I don't even see that translation because it's not my default translation, right? Like my default translation, for whatever it's worth, is the Koran Jerusalem Tanakh, which is dated and like actually probably in terms of like theologically complicated. I think it's basically based on King James. Which, like, that is not a Jewish translation. That's the one we should probably be fighting over. But the truth of the matter is, like, I kind of like the old King Jamesy language.
Yeah.
Like, it's a translation, right? It's nobody's touching the text, right? We're just talking about whether how many different translations are on Sefaria.
Would you have done anything differently though, given the reaction? Did you guys how do you conceptualize it now once it kind of picked up steam? What would you have maybe messaged differently, and what would you want to tell people who felt that sense of betrayal?
Oh, I actually think it came from our messaging, like on social, messaging on social media around this, like announcing it with kind of like a fanfare that suggested this was like
finally
better than any translation that ever existed before, which I don't even think is actually what we said, but like I think some people heard that maybe.
Yeah.
And that was, but that's not really what's going on here. And I'll tell you what I take away from it is like listening. And like I said, inclusivity really means like making a space that everybody is comfortable in. Like if there are people telling me that like something about Sefaria is making them uncomfortable, like I want to hear that. And like, we need to think about how we address that. And we are definitely thinking about that from a product perspective. The idea of separating sheets and the library, the Beit Midrash and the library is in part like the response is saying like, yeah, you know what? Yeah, you might be onto something here. So, hopefully like Jewish life can be a model of what life in a complicated, pluralistic world should look like, which is like, let's try and figure this out. And, we don't need to shout at each other, boycott, like, let's figure this out. Because I think we all want the same thing, which is to sanctify and shed the light on Torah and on our textual tradition. Yeah, so maybe it's naive to think that we can all agree on everything, and we don't have to, but like there are some things we can agree on.
Are there works that, again, because one of the things is like in a pluralistic society, there are some people who specifically when it comes to Torah don't accept that premise. And even those who accept the premise, there may be different approaches of what pluralistic means.
Totally. Yeah.
Are there boundaries or conversations about how expansive the online Jewish Sefaria library should be? Meaning, what works should be included? Because, like, so many of the classics are already there. I guess there's a lot more on, like, the responsa literature side.
Totally.
And you'll do that. But is there, like, a point where sometimes you're like, shoot, now we're at, like, a fork in the road where including one work is going to, by definition, exclude some communities who don't feel comfortable with it.
But again, I come back to the like founding metaphor of Sefaria, which is of a library. And one of the things that I think part of what was upsetting to people about this was the idea that they might like be forced to use this translation, right? Which nobody is forced to use anything on Sefaria. And I think it's important for us to not only like to make that real for people, like give people opportunities to customize their experience. So you know what? If you don't want to see anything that's been published since
1950,
or 1940 or whatever, I think we can design that so that you have a kind of an experience that is the one that you want, and you're able to get what you want out of Sefaria. But I really think about it like, you're walking through the YU library. There are going to be books there that you want to read, and there are going to be books there you don't want to read. And so long as nobody's like forcing you to read anything, I think we're doing our job correctly.
There is a deep humility in the way that you approach even your critics, even when the tone or even the way they may transmit things may not, be the ideal way to move the needle, but people express objections, and my instinctive reaction always is to be dismissive. Nobody likes hearing criticism, but the openness and the way that you approached with such thoughtfulness, with such technological creativity of how to address to make sure that this digital library of the Jewish people can continue to thrive is something that I personally found inspiring, because my first reaction was, I am situated within the Orthodox community. And even the Orthodox community, we weren't in lockstep. There wasn't like a secret meeting of all Orthodox Jews saying, we got a boy. It was I heard all sorts of different approaches. It was definitely a subject of conversation in the last few weeks. But to me, it pained me for I never want non-Orthodox Jews to feel like Torah is not for them. And I was afraid in the messaging, if we're so loud in the way we do this, that message of people who are objecting, for whatever reasons, for very holy reasons they were objecting, what I was concerned about was going to be a possessiveness of Torah, when in fact a Torah that is just for one type of person and one type of community is not even Torah at all. At the heart of what makes Torah Torah is its accessibility, is the fact that Morasha Kehilas Yaakov, that every type of Jew, it's the opening verse that we say from Masechah Sukkah, which you obviously know well. It's your opening point. But when a child learns to speak, it's Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe Morasha Kehilas Yaakov, that the Torah is a morasha, is a not just an inheritance, but an inheritance that is made for you to build upon and creatively interpret and play with. And that's really the morasha that Sefaria has bequeathed the Jewish people. So really thank you for that more than anything else. And I really wish you tremendous, tremendous success in everything that you do continuing forward. I always end my interviews with more rapid fire questions. I'm curious, what book recommendations, and I mean hard book recommendations, would you recommend for somebody that's really informed your own Jewish journey? Most generally, I mean, you said you came to kind of that more literacy-driven Judaism through Tractate Sukkah, but I'm curious if there are specific books that have really informed your Jewish identity.
I mean, I'm a big Heschelite. Like, really, if I was going to describe what motivates me spiritually, is like the pursuit of wonder, and his sense of wonder as the fundamental spiritual emotion, and how to seek that out and like bring that into one's life is something I think about every day and like matters to me incredibly deeply.
That is so beautiful. My next question, if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical with no responsibilities whatsoever to go back to school and complete a PhD for as long as you needed, what do you think the subject and title of your PhD would be?
Oh, well, I was originally planning to get a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology. That was my undergraduate major. I thought I was going to be a evolutionary biologist, a scientist. Turned out like being a scientist is of that kind is just not cut out for my ADHD kind of personality, or my sense of wanting to actually like build things and make things in the world. But I will say I would happily go spend 6 years, 7 years, whatever it takes these days, just immersed in like organismal biology, zoology, like the animal world, the insect world. I loved entomology. You want to experience wonder on a daily basis. Like you want to feel like a profound sense of how unbelievable this universe is. Like spend time really looking closely at the natural world. For me, that's like a deeply spiritual kind of thing. If I got to live another life, that's what I might do.
That is fascinating. There aren't that many Beshefkins in the world, but I have two first cousins who are from Bennington, Vermont, and one is a marine biologist and one is a rocket scientist. And I feel like, they grew up in a different community with different trajectories, and I've always marveled at what drew them in. My final question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
So I go to sleep when I go to sleep, I don't know, 10:30, 11-ish.
Okay.
And then I'm up at the 6:30 because I got two little kids who have to be made ready for the day.
Joshua Foer. Do you prefer Josh or Joshua? I just did Josh in the beginning, and then I switched to Joshua.
I'm actually indifferent.
Okay. That's like my David Dovid. I go either way.
It's Yitzhak, please.
Josh, I cannot thank you enough for your time today, and more importantly, for all the work that you've done on behalf of the Jewish people, making Jewish life and learning accessible to all. Thank you so much for joining and speaking with us today.
Thank you, David. This is really a pleasure, and I hope we can do it again soon.
God willing. The questions of exclusivity and inclusivity when it comes to Torah learning are extraordinarily important, and I hope that Sefaria remains something that is for the entire Jewish community that people are able to feel themselves in. And I hope that they're able to navigate this in a way. And I look at myself as a partner in this and helping them navigate this in a way that those who never felt any distance or sense of betrayal with Sefaria are able to feel a sense of uplifting, and they don't feel that marginalized in their Torah learning, like I'm learning with the tool that I'm not supposed to be. And specifically, people who do feel outraged are able to either express that in a healthy and constructive way without undermining all those others, and that Sefaria is able to respond and use this experience to really uplift and create that vehicle for Torah learning that is in fact for Klal Yisrael, because that is what Torah learning is for. As many of you may know and have seen, I write an article along with Daf Yomi for Tablet Magazine. Tablet Magazine does programming with Daf Yomi. They have a Daf Yomi that's really very inclusive called Take One, that I do with Liel Leibovitz. And at the end of every tractate, I write an article that talks about kind of the themes of the tractate. And the first article that I wrote, which was called Arguing About the Talmud, which was after we completed the first tractate that related to tractate Brachos, I touched upon the fact that Daf Yomi now has been embraced by communities that have not traditionally been involved in deep Talmud study. And how should we be thinking about this? How should we be reacting to it? Is it something that we should appreciate, or something that we should kind of, traditional Talmud learning, in the yeshiva, something we should kind of feel a little uncomfortable with, because a lot of the explanations and ideas that come out maybe from less traditional or less educated communities may not be in line with the larger Masorah that we have. This is what I wrote, and many Talmudic newcomers were confronted with the very question on the first page of Brachos, which the Talmud asks, Tana Hechi Kai, on the basis of what prior knowledge do these novices feel adequately prepared and proper to enter the reverential world of Talmud study? Me'emasai, again, using the language from the first page of Brachos, from when was it considered appropriate to have a queer Daf Yomi, or Daf Yomi memes, or Daf Yomi swag? Did we, some wondered, construct the entrance to the beginning of Talmud too broadly? And it was in that question, in response to that question, I wrote an entire article, but there is one passage that really, really stuck with me that I'd like to kind of conclude this episode with, and it's from the Gemara in Brachos on 22a, where there is a story of a student. The Talmud says, Maisa b'Talmud echad, there is a story where there was a particular student, Shahaya Magamgein Lamala me Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. He was stuttering, probably in the context of the Gemara, was ritually impure at a seminal emission, and was uncomfortable, was stuttering through the words of Talmud. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira approaches this Talmud and says something so beautiful. Amar le, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says to this student, Bini, my child, Psach picha via iru divarecha. Open up your mouth, speak with confidence, and let your words illuminate, let your words shine, because the words of Torah cannot be recipients of tumah, of ritual impurity. She'ein divrei Torah makablin tumah. And I think a lot about that when I see people who maybe are not in the context of a traditional Beit Midrash. I grew up in that world, and you see people who are outside of that world engage in Torah study. And I understand the initial reaction that you see, you feel uncomfortable, and maybe even it's coming sometimes from an unhealthy place, from a possessiveness, or from whatever it is, or it's coming from a healthy place where you see the explanations and approach can sometimes be incorrect or speculative or just flat out wrong. And I do believe, generally speaking, there are obvious exceptions to everything, but generally speaking, I think what the Gemara, what the Talmud, what the idea of Jewish learning is asking from all of us is to look at all of those pockets in the community of people who are trying to engage sincerely and faithfully in Torah study in each generation, and beckon them in and welcome them in and say, B'ni psach picha v'ya'iru divarecha, my child, open up your mouth and let your words shine, let your words illuminate. And that's really the Torah that is for Knesset Yisrael, for all of the Jewish people. And I am grateful for Sefaria for being a leader and navigating that. And it's not always going to be easy. There's some very real questions that emerge when you try to construct a doorway that is so broad, that is for so many people, that is so inclusive, it leads to exclusivity. But I am, for one, very appreciative for their work in constructing that doorway and allowing so many who otherwise would not have had access to hear the voice of Torah reach out to them and say, B'ni, my child, psach picha, open up your mouth, v'ya'iru devarecha, and let your word shine. Find your place in Torah. It is for everyone. And let the words of Torah through the generations illuminate and shine through you. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was actually not edited by Tina Emerson. We have our stand-in Rob, who we love and we appreciate. Thank you, Rob, for your edits of this episode. I am so grateful. It wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number is 917-720-5629. Once again, that number is 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.